Hi, my name's Mark Fulcher and I'm from Access Sports Medicine. Welcome to this edition of The Spin, where our aim here is to try and keep you up to date with what's happening in sport and exercise medicine. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Katherine Forch, who is a concussion specialist physiotherapist. So welcome, Katherine.
Thank you.
And today we're going to be talking about concussion and baseline testing and some of the different types of baseline testing that's available, which is something that is right in front of your mind, isn't it, Katherine? What have you got going on there?
Dear to my heart. So I'm doing a PhD at the moment, and I'm quite interested in developing some objective measures, so things that we can kind of measure to give us an indication of kind of recovery or overall brain health. And so I'm looking at a few different metrics for that, particularly to look at return to play testing. And I know I find if I have an athlete in front of me who does have some baseline data, it just makes your job as a clinician so much easier because you have a level of confidence in some of the numbers that you've got ahead of you about whether that's normal for that particular person. Because we all vary in terms of having weird, wonderful things, and that's where baseline testing I find really helpful.
Great. And so, like at the moment, what are the sort of tools that you use to help identify whether someone's recovered from a concussion?
Well, in terms of baseline testing, I sort of think about it as two parts. There's some value in using it actually to identify things that could put somebody at risk of a concussion or even sort of performance-based measures. And then there's things that help with the clinical decision-making kind of at the back end when we're looking at recovery. I suppose if we're talking about what particular tests we want to choose, there's a couple of different things I like to think about, and without getting too stats heavy on it, there's a few key properties of tests we need to think about. So if I use the analogy of my 4-year-old giving me a high five, now each time he gives me that high five, it might be slightly different. And so if I'm using that particular high five as a measurement tool, then it's not very helpful. So we want to try and look at tests that have low variability between time points, and also things that can ideally be tested by somebody else. So I might have done the test for them at baseline, but another physio could repeat it, and we should get a similar result if that person is kind of in a healthy state. The other thing that we want to have a think about with tools is looking at their validity, so whether they're actually testing what we think they're testing. So if I look at my 4-year-old giving me a high five and I say, well, that's a measure of his hand-eye coordination, it's a bit of a stretch. So it's this idea of looking at kind of the construct validity, or is the tool actually testing what we're sort of trying to test? So I'm trying to look at sort of ways to instrument or use technology to help make the amount of variability a little bit less. So balance is a really good example. So clinically, sometimes people have probably experienced like a timed balance test. Your clinician might get you to stand on one foot or stand with your feet like this, and they'll time you and maybe count how many errors. But we're trying to add a layer of objectivity to that. So using things like force plates or technology to help give us some closer numbers.
Okay. So, I mean, that's a great example. So, like, how would we use a force plate to do that? So lots of us have got access to those types of systems in the clinic. We've got some ideas around what we could do with them.
So it's been really cool seeing the uptake in tech across clinics, and I think particularly physios and strength and conditioning folks will be using them from a strength testing point of view. So often we'll see kind of reactive force or those type of measures, but they're really useful for assessing balance. So I have a little set protocol that I do. So it's standardized. The instructions are standardized so that we're trying to reduce the variability as much as possible. Play around with the sensory information. So what my protocol looks like is basically taking the surrounds off the decks, bringing them in together so it's a more narrow stance, and then seeing what that person's like with eyes open and eyes closed and whether they're on a compliant surface or not. Because some people will be, for example, much wobblier when you put them on a compliant surface in a normal healthy state.
Yeah, so it feels to me like the optimal option here is to have some pre-injury data that you can compare to. But do you think that you've got enough of a battery of normative data that you can then compare people based on what you think they should be like?
Yeah, and that's part of what I'm trying to develop with my PhD is kind of here's what the usual profile of someone who's competing in, reasonably high level sport should look like across some of these measures. But it's also interesting to look at how those measures change over time. So I'm also looking at pre and post exertion. So for example, if someone, like we're talking about balance, if they get significantly wobblier when they're tired, then that could put them at a risk of more injury. you can almost use that person as a baseline for themselves if we're looking at pre and post exertion testing. But ideally, being pre-armed with that before they have an injury makes life a lot easier down the track.
So the baseline test that I'm the most familiar with, I guess the SCAT is something that's widely done, but I think we probably agree it's a pretty blunt instrument that probably isn't that helpful. But next to that, we use a cognogram in professional sport. So it's a computer-based neuropsychological test. And the reason we use that is because we know that when we think people have clinically recovered, so they've got no symptoms, they examine well, they've gone through a graded return to play, we know that if you use that as a measurement tool, that about 30% of them still have some persisting cognitive impairment. Do you think that that's likely to be similar with these physical kind of tests? Do you think we'll be able to pick up that level of impairment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely plausible. So we know that people who return to sport after concussion have at least twice the risk of a subsequent injury, and that particularly the first year after returning to play. And as you mentioned, cognition is one area that's been shown to have some lingering impairments potentially. But I think that the sort of balance, the visual system, some of those things can also be responsible for that increased risk of injury. And it comes back to something we like to look at in the clinic in terms of subtyping concussions. So concussions can have a particularly dominant presentation. Some people might have a vestibular dominant concussion and their balance is affected and they're quite dizzy, or they might have lots of headache and their neck might be problematic or things like this. And so it's making sure we've got tools that cover all of those different subtypes of concussion. And yeah, you're completely right. Cognogram's an incredibly useful tool for assessing of cognition.
Do you sort of think that these tests are going to become fairly commonplace? All rugby players should have this type of battery of tests, or is this something that you're thinking that is more for people who've had concussion histories, or is this something for professional sports people? Where do you think these tests will sit in, and how many tests do you think you'll be doing?
I mean, it's a tricky one, right? Because then we start to get into the kind of access and equity situations. Obviously, if somebody's in professional sport, they have a lot higher level of access to qualified people and fancy pieces of kit and all the rest of it. But something I was a real priority for me in terms of my PhD work was looking at something that was quite accessible. So it was low instrumentation as much as possible, and something that, somebody who is maybe a relatively junior physio looking after the second 15 at Marist College could kind of pick up these simple tests and do. So I think that it is something that we're going to see becoming a little bit more widespread. So you will see people doing symptom reporting based across teams. That's fairly common, but that can be a little bit tricky because it takes quite a lot of time to go through a symptom scale with an entire team. And there's a fair amount of research showing that athletes will under-report their baselines because they know that if they have a injury, they're wanting to get back on the field and they don't want anything to hinder that. And so I think having things that we can test, so it's impossible to kind of throw it, for want of a better word, will add value to that.
Cool. And in your PhD, if you think about your battery of tests, probably as it sits as part of your PhD protocol, and then if you sort of think about what it might look like in 2 or 3 years once you've finished, what do you think it will look like? Do you think it's going to be a couple of tests? Do you think it's going to be 5 tests? Like, how long will it take?
At the moment, it's sitting at about 8 minutes. So it's a little 8-minute cluster that you would do before and after exertion. So essentially 2 times 8 minutes. And I'm looking at the sort of time course of it so that we should be able to have some pretty good clinical recommendations around, like, somebody needs to come off the field and within 10 minutes you need to assess these things and have a look for that. But the main ones of interest at the moment is sort of visual scanning performance. I'm looking at kind of dual tasking, so how people's walking changes when they're sort of doing something else. And as I mentioned, some of the instrumented balance.
Yeah. And one of the things you said before, I think people probably don't understand that there is this increased risk of all injury in the time period after concussion. Can you unpack that a little bit? Like, why do you think that is? And do you think it's possible to reduce that risk?
My gut, I mean, it's never going to be one single thing, right? So there's the overarching part of it, which is probably that the person's had a period of time off playing. So is there some deconditioning kind of component to it? Then there's kind of the psychological side of it. So there's a fair amount of work showing that people returning after concussion have fear of re-injury, so they may act slightly different. They have different kind of risk-taking behaviors. So that kind of psychological readiness piece, I think, is really, really important to think about. We think about it in terms of dislocation injuries in the shoulder, for example, but it's not often applied to concussion, but I think it's really useful there. But I think it's for me, a kind of, if we focus on the physical systems, it's that ability to integrate those things really efficiently. So if your timing is slightly off, if your visual scanning slightly off, your reaction time slightly off, your balance is slightly off, that's where all of those really carefully calibrated kind of protective responses that help prevent injury just aren't quite working properly. So ACL is a really good example. So we know that ACL injury is one of the things that you have a much higher risk for. And there's a huge amount of work looking at the causes of ACL injury. So we know there's that kind of penultimate step, deceleration side of it, and the sort of force transfer. And if you think about the control of that, it's so nuanced in terms of when muscles fire, when they're supposed to be, the joint knowing it's in the right place, like all of those sort of things. So we're quite finely calibrated machines. So if we're off slightly, then that kind of makes sense.
So I guess the idea is then if you identify it, then you can do something about it, delay a return to play, retest, and then hopefully mitigate some of that risk.
Yeah, that's where I think we want to head. We have a more comprehensive return to play battery with the idea that we'll pick up some of these more lingering impairments that sort of have historically just snuck along under the surface. Because we know that when people achieve symptom recovery, so when they feel better, doesn't necessarily mean that they're completely recovered in terms of their sort of physiological responses.
Yeah. So, I mean, I alluded to that before, but there's a great example that already exists in the literature around cognitive function and cognogram tests. So these tests are something that every professional rugby or rugby league player would have prior to a season playing rugby in New Zealand. And I guess one of the things that I feel quite strongly about is that shouldn't just be a professional sport thing, right? So being able to access that for community players, particularly guys who've had concussions before, we know for sure that you're going to safely or more safely return up to a third of people who've had concussion. So there's a really interesting opportunity, I think, to look at that type of test, your sort of test battery in, community rugby, club rugby, school rugby.
Yeah, absolutely. I just had a text from a physio the other day who works with a kind of junior development sort of team. And so you're talking about a high risk group for underreporting of symptoms, so kind of 17 to 19-year-olds. And he was saying that, he was exactly like, well, when should we be testing these things? And I said, in an ideal world, kind of having more data points in a series means that you can really get an idea of what's the trend for that player. And so I think people in the community having access to those things, that's a really exciting development.
Yeah, it feels probably ambitious to say that everybody who plays rugby or equestrian or snowboard should have these sorts of things, but it feels like we should be offering it to people. So I think.
And it's great that you mention sports outside of rugby, because I see it all the time. Concussion's a rugby problem. It's not. I mean, in clinic, we see people doing all sorts of weird and wonderful active endeavors.
Yeah, that's true.
And so it's like, hey, basketball has really high concussion incidents, like all of these kind of things, people having the option to have a little bit of information that's there in their back pocket so that if they have an injury, we're a little bit more informed about how we manage them.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at presentations to the emergency department, the footballing codes don't even meet the top 5.
No.
Falling off bikes, falling out of trees, all sorts of other novel and dumb ways to hurt yourself. But it is an interesting point about it being a rugby problem. It's definitely not that. Well, I mean, rugby does its fair share just purely because of participation. But I think, in my opinion, rugby gets a little bit of a bad rap.
Well, there's lots of things embedded that, that New Zealand Rugby's been doing a lot of work around awareness. And I think they're ahead of the game in my experience compared to other sports where, we've had some MMA fighters, for example. They don't do any baseline testing, but the whole point of the sport is to knock each other out. So that's kind of interesting.
So I guess kind of on that then, how, if you wanted to get some baseline testing or you wanted to come in and be measured or be part of your study, what should people do?
Well, there's a couple of options. They can, reach out to be part of the healthy group. So I have a concussed group and a healthy group in my current study. They have to have not had a concussion in the last year to be eligible for the healthy group. And we're looking for sort of athletes aged between 18 to 40. So if they're keen on that, then they can reach out.
Am I an athlete? What do you have to be an athlete?
Well, I mean, I heard a rumor you did high rocks, but I don't know if you meet the age requirements, Fulch.
No,
So either participating in...
Are you? Well, what's the criteria?
I currently don't meet my criteria. So you have to be either playing in organised team sport, so you might get there with social footy, organised team sport, or you're participating in more than 75 minutes a week of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So easy.
Come on,
easy.
Surely,
You'll be in.
Surely you make that. Too busy PhDing. Okay, so that would be the healthy group.
Yeah.
And then the concussed group, like you have to have been concussed within a certain period of time?
Yeah, so still recovering, and it has to be a sports-related mechanism for that particular study. So any sport, I had someone a couple of weeks ago who was a go-karting injury, so we took that. That was sports.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, ideally still recovering. And then we time their testing when it's appropriate through their recovery. So if they're interested, like reaching out early on is often the case, and we get medical clearance from their treating doctor before they participate in this study.
Okay. And what about people that just might be interested in having this type of test? How would they organise that?
So we do have a couple of offerings in terms of baseline testing. I know that we can do Cognogram only, so we have access to that through our website. People can jump on and do that.
That's the Access website?
That's the Access sports medicine website. And we also have tailored options if clubs or school teams are interested in getting a whole lot of their players through. So really reach out and we can have a chat about putting together something for them.
Cool. Yeah, and those cognograms, just maybe lots of people haven't done them, but they're kind of like an old-fashioned computer game, right? So you're having to react to cards that are flipping over. And it's a pretty easy thing to do that you can use. You can do at home. Takes about 10 minutes. And then that baseline gets stored on the cloud. And then if you are re-injured, you can test yourself against your own baseline.
Yeah. And everyone who comes through our service will have that done. So we're starting to build a really nice bank of information for people. The other thing I probably haven't mentioned that I find really useful from pre-injury baseline testing is that some people have, as I mentioned, weird and wonderful things. So eye alignment is a really good example. So some people's eyes don't track smoothly in a normal healthy state, and knowing about that beforehand is really helpful, because then if they have an injury, we know it's not because of their concussion, that how they work.
Yeah, cool. Hey, well, good luck with the PhD.
Thank you.
How much longer do you think you got to go?
How long is a piece of string? No, probably about a year, I reckon.
A year.
Depends how many kind folks decide to participate in the study. So
So help Katherine out, everybody. Yeah. We need more people. Hey, thanks for spending 20 minutes or so with us, Katherine. Really appreciate it. And thank you for all listening. Keep an eye out online. If you're interested in learning more about baseline testing, have a look. We've got some stuff on the website, but otherwise feel free to reach out to Katherine or myself, and we're happy to kind of talk about this a bit more. So thanks, Kat.
Cool.
And thank you. See you next time.